Welcome to Demon Sleep. I'm here to help you unwind tonight. If you enjoy this space, feel free to like and subscribe. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. It makes this feel like a shared night across the world. These stories are different and I'm glad you're here. Dim the lights, let the room settle, and let's begin. Story 1: When Two Became One. The trouble began the day the veil came down from storage. Morning light filled the kitchen, gentle and ordinary, while Caroline stood at the counter preparing vegetables for supper. Her knife moved in steady rhythms until her body betrayed her. Without warning, her neck locked. A sharp, unnatural pressure bloomed between her shoulders, forcing a gasp from her chest. The blade slipped from her hand and struck the counter with a metallic snap. Across the room, her mother continued unwrapping the veil as if nothing had happened. She moved slowly, carefully, peeling back layers of yellowed paper the way one handles relics meant to outlast memory itself. "Stand up straight," her mother said, her tone firm and unquestioning. "You're folding in on yourself." Caroline obeyed, or tried to. The moment she lifted her spine, the pressure deepened, as though something unseen had settled more firmly into place. The kitchen air felt thick, heavy with familiar scents. Dried flowers tucked into drawers, polished wood, and beneath it all, something intimate and unsettling, like warmth too close to the skin. By afternoon, she was sitting in a doctor's office with floors the same dull green as her old school hallways. While the physician pressed cold fingers along her back, Caroline found herself counting tiles to steady her breathing. "Lean forward," he said gently. "Tell me when it hurts." She almost laughed. The pain wasn't a point, it was a presence. It existed everywhere and nowhere, the way grief did. A dull ache threaded through her entire being. The diagnosis came easily: wetting nerves, emotional tension. Brides her age often carried stress in their bodies. The date was soon, just over 2 weeks away. He scribbled notes recommending medication, warmth, rest. Once the ceremony passed, he assured her her posture would correct itself. Everything would ease. Caroline sat silently, her hands folded in her lap. Through the window behind him, a clock tower marked the afternoon hour. She watched the minute hand inch forward and thought of another time, another clock, the barn, the rope, the exact moment her sister's life had ended. How their mother had found her, motionless except for the faintest sway. How no one had heard a sound because silence had always been Rachel's way. The words escaped Caroline before she could stop them. "It feels like something's weighing me down," she said. "Like I'm carrying more than I should." The doctor hesitated. He spoke then of loss, of shared beginnings and incomplete endings. Twins, he said softly, often bore grief in physical ways. The body remembered what the mind refused to hold. His pen clicked shut. The prescription slid across the desk, still warm from his hand. If the pain remained after the wedding, they would look deeper. At home, the veil waited. Her mother had draped it across Caroline's bed with careful symmetry, smoothing every fold as if preparing an offering. It looked fragile, luminous, impossibly delicate. And yet, as Caroline stood in the doorway, her shoulders ached with a familiar pressure, steady, patient, unmoving. The wedding was coming, and something was determined to arrive with her. The bedroom that had once held 2 girls now belonged to only one. Caroline stood at the doorway, unable to step inside. Nothing had been removed. Rachel's presence lingered everywhere, in the brush resting on the dresser, tangled with dark strands of hair, in the nightgown folded beneath the pillow, in the slippers placed neatly beside the bed, positioned as if their owner had simply stepped out for a moment and would return when she was ready. The room had not accepted the idea of absence. The veil lay across the bed, pale and motionless. It didn't look delicate, it looked expectant. When Caroline finally crossed the threshold, the pressure returned with certainty. No longer vague, no longer imagined. It settled onto her shoulders like a deliberate touch, firm and possessive, as though unseen hands had claimed their place. Her breath caught. She blamed the medication, the dizziness, the way the room seemed slightly off balance. She blamed the chill at the base of her skull on a cracked window, a draft slipping in unnoticed. She repeated these explanations like prayers while pressing warm cloths against her neck, swallowing pills that dulled her thoughts and softened the edges of reality. At night, she slept in the bed they had shared since childhood. Sometimes she told herself she was alone. Sometimes she wasn't sure. In the stillness, she heard breathing that didn't always match her own. Slow, familiar, patient. Nothing improved. William noticed first. It was Sunday after service, standing beneath harsh lights in the parish hall with paper cups of thin coffee warming their hands. He reached out, resting his palm lightly on her shoulder, concern written plainly across his face. "You're leaning," he said. "You're not standing straight." She repeated what the doctor had told her. Stress, anticipation, wetting nerves. William's thumb moved in small, absent circles against her shoulder blade. His voice dropped, half joking, half not. "You look like something sitting on you." The coffee went cold instantly. Caroline felt it before she saw it, the sudden drop in temperature, sharp and unnatural. Steam still rose from the cup, but the warmth was gone. Behind William, through the tall windows, her mother stood speaking with another woman from the church. Their heads leaned close together, mouths moving with rehearsed sympathy. Caroline knew that tone. Rachel's name would surface there, folded into hushed words and careful pauses, wrapped in sorrow and quiet curiosity. "I'm fine," Caroline said quickly. But the word didn't sound like hers. It came out softer, higher, almost gentle. Rachel's voice. Rachel's way of lying. Her hand flew to her throat. That night she saw the mark. She had been brushing her hair at the vanity, the same one they had shared for years, arguing over mirror space in the mornings. As she lifted the brush, a dark shape flickered at the edge of her reflection. She turned her head to look directly at her neck. Nothing. But when she faced the mirror again, it was there. Clear, distinct. A bruise just beneath her hairline, shaped unmistakably like fingertips pressed into skin, as though someone had held her there, firmly, intimately from behind. Something was holding her. She reached back, pressing her fingers to the tender place. Her skin felt alive, warm beneath her touch. But the mark in the mirror looked different, dusky, chilled, as though it didn't belong entirely to her body, as if it were sinking inward instead of fatting. The medication dragged her into a heavy, dreamless sleep, so deep that she missed her alarm entirely. Morning came violently. Her mother shook her shoulder, sharp and impatient, and Caroline jerked awake with a cry. The pressure had multiplied overnight. What had once felt like hands now felt like a full body, dense, insistent, pinning her to the mattress. Lifting her head took effort. Sitting up felt like defying gravity itself. "The seamstress needs you by 10, her mother said briskly. "She won't wait." She lingered in the doorway, watching Caroline struggle to rise, her lips tightening in a familiar way. "You know," she added, "Rachel started bending like that near the end." A pause too long. A dreadful habit, stand up straight, don't be like your sister. Then she was gone. The room fell quiet again, except for Caroline's unsteady breathing. She swayed on her feet, fighting the invisible force dragging her forward, and then the scent reached her. Soft floral, sweet enough to choke on. Lily of the valley. Rachel's perfume. Their grandmother's gift. The one Caroline had never touched because it made her chest constrict and her eyes sting, because it felt too intimate, too final. Her wedding dress waited in her mother's closet, hidden beneath a clean white sheet. It had not been meant for her. It had been ordered for Rachel first, months earlier, when Rachel had been engaged, glowing, promising a future to a man from another city with a respectable profession and a reliable car. 2 weeks before the ceremony, Rachel ended it. No explanation, no tears, just silence. 6 weeks later, she was found in the barn, neck snapped, a single line written carefully on paper, an apology that explained nothing. The dress remained, so it was altered, reclaimed, reassigned. Caroline stood on the raised platform at the seamstress's shop while Mrs. Gable circled her like a hawk, pins clenched between her teeth, clicking her tongue in disapproval. She spoke about posture, about sloping shoulders, about how the bodice refused to sit correctly. "I'm standing straight," Caroline said, her voice thin with effort. Mrs. Gable disagreed without hesitation. She reached out, pressing 2 fingers firmly against Caroline's back through the fabric. She found the center instantly. Caroline gasped. The seamstress frowned. She felt it too, the unnatural curve, the place where something pulled her forward. She asked if Caroline noticed it. "If you keep standing like this," she warned, "the dress will never fall right." Caroline lifted her eyes to the 3-paneled mirror. The woman staring back at her looked wrong. Her shoulders were drawn inward, her spine bent, her head angled down as if compelled to look at the floor. Caroline tried to straighten. The reflection did not follow. "I don't understand," she whispered. And for the first time, she wasn't sure she was the one deciding how her body stood at all. Mrs. Gable demonstrated what she meant, pulling her own shoulders back, lifting her chin with practiced elegance. Caroline mimicked the stance exactly. She felt the effort burn through her spine. In the mirror, nothing changed. Her reflection stayed folded forward, submissive, wrong. Mrs. Gable, standing beside her, didn't react. She smiled in approval, declared the posture improved, and told Caroline not to move while she worked the pins into place. That night, Caroline opened the drawer she had been avoiding. She had postponed this reckoning since the funeral, unwilling to disturb the quiet remains of her sister's final days. Each item felt intimate, intrusive. A lipstick worn flat on one side, library books overdue by months, and beneath them, a small diary with a broken lock. Their mother had snapped it open once, searching desperately for meaning, something more than a single apologetic sentence. She hadn't found it. Caroline did. Her hands trembled as she turned the pages. The early entries were plain, almost dull. "Mama ordered my dress today. Tried on the veil, it fits." Then the tone shifted. "Can't sleep, neck aches. Doctor says it's nerves. The pressure is worse." Caroline's fingertips went numb. "I feel her with me all the time now." Her breathing faltered as she kept reading. "She won't let go. I know what she wants." The words blurred. "I told Mark I can't marry him. He doesn't understand. Mama is furious, she doesn't see." Page after page, the same fear tightening. "I tried to explain. No one listens. It's harder to breathe. I'm so tired. The final entry was dated the day before Rachel died. The handwriting wavered, barely holding together. She wants the dress. She wants the wedding. I won't give it to her. Caroline couldn't swallow. Something shifted on her shoulders. The pressure rearranged itself, deliberate, intimate. For the first time, she felt what could only be fingers, thin, relentless, curling at the base of her skull. She slammed the diary shut. In the dark window, her reflection stared back, bent over the book. But now she saw what she had refused to see before. Another shape. A second shadow pressed flush against her spine, smaller, closer, perfectly aligned. The cold spot at her neck warmed as if a cheek had settled there. Caroline stood. The weight rose with her smoothly, instinctively, like a body that had learned her movements long ago, as if it had been here long before the pain, long before the veil, long before the wedding date. Her thoughts raced backward, Rachel's final weeks, the same symptoms, the broken engagement, the unexplained apology, her mother's anger loud and blind. She thought of twins in the womb, how they begin as one, how sometimes the split is incomplete, how one life can absorb another, carry it unseen for years. She remembered childhood, matching dresses, shared names, shared faces, strangers unable to tell them apart. And standing there, with another presence breathing against her neck, Caroline finally understood. They had never truly been two at all. Rachel had always been the quieter half. She followed where Caroline led. Let Caroline answer questions meant for both of them. Let Caroline step forward while she stayed just behind, content to exist in the shared shadow. That had been their balance, their unspoken agreement. Caroline stared at her own reflection and remembered the words from the diary. She wants the dress. She wants the wedding. Slowly, she lifted her hair from her neck. The mirror no longer bothered pretending. Dark marks spread across her skin, finger-shaped bruises overlapping and deepening, proof of a grip that had grown more confident with time. Not an attack, a hold. Then she saw it. Just for a second outline within the glass, the soft curve of a cheek, a stray lock of hair that didn't quite match the way hers fell, a face that could have been Caroline's or Rachel. There was no way to tell. There never had been. An hour later, her mother found her still standing there. She snapped about the time, about exhaustion, about how close the wedding was, and how Caroline needed to start acting like it mattered. Caroline watched her mother move through the room in the mirror, watched how her eyes skimmed past the glass without pausing, without seeing the second face hovering just behind Caroline's shoulder, half hidden in the spill of her hair. That night, Caroline didn't sleep easily. She lay on her side in the bed they had shared growing up, the mattress remembering two bodies instead of one. The weight pressed against her back, solid now, unmistakable. Cold breath brushed her neck. Fingers clutched her shoulders, not cruelly but desperately, like someone terrified of slipping away. She thought of the diary, of the steady march toward fear written in Rachel's careful hand, of how her sister had fought this presence alone, dismissed and doubted, carrying something no one else would acknowledge. She thought of the broken engagement, of the choice Rachel had made. The pills waited on the nightstand untouched. Caroline didn't take them. She didn't want numbness. She wanted clarity. She wanted to know this thing fully, the way Rachel must have known it in her final days, awake, isolated, unheard. At some point, sleep claimed her anyway. She woke to her mother's hands shaking her shoulder and sunlight pouring through the window too harshly, too bright. Her mother was already talking about the final fitting, about schedules, about how today mattered, about how there was only 1 week left and everyone was depending on her to get this right, to not destroy things the way Rachel had. Caroline tried to sit up. The presence on her back was overwhelming now, a full weight, a second body fused to her own. When she attempted to stand, her legs gave way. Her mother grabbed her arm, fingers biting hard enough to leave marks. Her face had taken on that familiar expression, focused, efficient, resolute. The look she wore when something threatened the plan. The look that said she would handle this. The look that said she would not, under any circumstances, admit there was something terribly, impossibly wrong. Acknowledge that anything was wrong. The final fitting stretched on for hours. Mrs. Gable circled, pinned, stepped back, frowned, and circled again. Each adjustment came with the same instruction: stand straighter, spoken with growing irritation. The implication was clear. The fault lay with Caroline, not the dress. Caroline barely heard her. She watched herself in the 3-paneled mirror, watched the gown fall incorrectly over a body that no longer aligned the way it should, watched the shape behind her sharpen with every pull of fabric and every pin driven home. Rachel's face was almost fully visible now in the reflection, pressed close to Caroline's neck. The expression was achingly familiar, resolve tangled with panic. The same look Rachel had worn as a child in crowded places, fingers locked tight around Caroline's hand, terrified of being lost. That night, William came for dinner. Their mother served pot roast, the house filled with the heavy scent of cooked meat and vegetables boiled past tenderness. Beneath it all lingered another smell, tension, stretched thin by pretense. Their mother spoke brightly, insistently, as if cheerfulness alone could hold reality in place. William sat across from Caroline, asking polite questions about seating arrangements, travel plans, the trip they were supposed to take south once everything was finished. Caroline answered automatically. Her voice sounded steady, practiced, but she watched William closely. His eyes kept drifting to her shoulders, to the way she bent over her plate, to the awkward grip of her fork, as if her hands no longer obeyed her properly. "Caroline," he said finally. Something in his tone made her look up. There was hesitation there, uncertainty, maybe even fear. "Are you sure you want to do this?" The question settled heavily between them. Their mother froze. The weight on Caroline's shoulders shifted, tightening. Rachel's fingers dug in. That cold cheek pressed harder against her neck, possessive and urgent. "Yes," Caroline said, "I'm sure." The word felt wrong as it left her mouth, shaped by a tongue that didn't feel entirely hers. William's eyes flickered, widening just slightly as if he'd heard it too. But he didn't argue. He only nodded and looked away. Caroline knew the truth then. She wasn't sure of anything anymore, except that Rachel was there. Had always been there. The quieter twin, the follower, the one who had never fully learned how to be alone. The one who had tried briefly to separate herself, to love someone else, to build a life that didn't include Caroline and had broken under the strain. The wedding was 6 days away. Caroline stopped sleeping. She lay awake night after night with Rachel's weight pressed into her back, her sister's breath cold against her skin. Memories surfaced uninvited. Childhood scenes replayed themselves. Rachel waking from nightmares, crawling silently into Caroline's bed, clinging as if separation itself were dangerous. Caroline had always let her stay, always let her cling. And now, in the dark, with another body wrapped around her own, Caroline began to understand that Rachel never truly left. She had simply found a way to stay. Crawl into Caroline's bed in the middle of the night. Rachel's fists would clutch the fabric of Caroline's nightgown like an anchor, knuckles white with fear. In the mornings, their mother would find them tangled together, bodies curved inward, holding space where nothing else could exist. Caroline remembered the day she announced her engagement. Rachel had smiled and said all the right things, but her eyes had been wrong, too wide, too fragile. Fear sat just beneath the surface. 2 weeks later, Rachel announced her own engagement, hurried and brittle, as if she were racing a clock only she could hear, as if she needed to prove she could stand alone. Then came the calling off. Then the funeral. Caroline remembered standing beside the grave, waiting for the ache everyone promised would come. It never did. Rachel didn't feel gone. She felt closer than she ever had in life. 5 days before the wedding, Caroline returned to the doctor. The office felt wrong, smaller, tighter. The green floor tiles seemed pressed too close together. The windows narrowed as if the room itself were leaning in. She told him the pain had worsened, that the medication did nothing, that no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't straighten her back. He examined her carefully, fingers tracing her spine with clinical precision. He spoke of chronic tension, of stress responses, of bodies manifesting what minds could not release. He suggested therapy. He spoke gently of grief, of the unique trauma of losing a twin. "She isn't gone," Caroline said. The doctor's expression changed. Concern sharpened into something else, something cautious. Caroline recognized it instantly. She had crossed a line. He wrote notes in neat, controlled handwriting, prescribed stronger medication, suggested postponing the ceremony, mentioned carefully that perhaps the pressure of the wedding was reopening wounds, that maybe she wasn't ready, that her fiancé would understand. Caroline accepted the prescription. She never filled it. Instead, she went home, locked the bedroom door, and stood before the mirror for a long time. The reflection showed a woman bent forward unnaturally, and behind her, no longer a blur, no longer a suggestion, a shape, a body pressed flush against her back, a sister's arms wrapped around her shoulders. Rachel had no eyes of her own anymore. She borrowed Caroline. She looked out at the world through them, desperate and watchful, clinging because death had taken everything else, everything except the terror of being alone. "What do you want?" Caroline whispered to the glass. The reflection didn't speak, but the weight shifted. Rachel's cheek slid against her neck. The cold sank deeper, settling into bone and marrow. And with a clarity that stole her breath, Caroline understood exactly what Rachel wanted. What Rachel had always wanted, and what had been denied to them both from the very beginning. They had been dressed alike, spoken for together, treated as a matched set instead of two lives. Separate names, identical expectations. No space to become different, no permission to grow apart. Rachel hadn't wanted independence the way people imagined it. She hadn't wanted distance. She wanted the wedding. She wanted the dress on her own body. She wanted to walk the aisle. She wanted to stand at the altar and be chosen. And Caroline, who had always let Rachel follow, who had always been the place Rachel anchored herself, was the only way left for her to do it. 4 days before the ceremony, William came to the house. Caroline's mother made an excuse and left them alone in the parlor. William sat stiffly on the sofa, hat clasped between his hands, his face carefully arranged into something gentle and firm at the same time. He said he'd been thinking about the wedding, about Caroline's health, about whether waiting might be wise. He said he loved her. He said he wanted her happy. He said if she needed more time, he would understand. No, Caroline said. The word came out sharp, final. I don't need more time. William studied her then, truly studied her. He saw the way her shoulders curved forward unnaturally, the way her head tilted as if pulled by invisible weight, the hollowness beneath her eyes. He saw a stranger wearing Caroline's face. You're not yourself, he said quietly. I know, Caroline replied. It was the truest thing she'd said in weeks. He left without suggesting a new date, without promising to wait, without making vows he wasn't sure he could keep. Caroline watched from the window as his car disappeared down the drive. Relief flooded her body, but it wasn't hers. Rachel loosened her grip just slightly. The pressure on Caroline's shoulders shifted, redistributed, settling in with the calm satisfaction of someone prepared to wait, someone who knew the ending was inevitable. Her mother's fury followed. She raged about money spent, flowers ordered, the church reserved. She accused Caroline of selfishness, of ingratitude. She said Rachel had been dead for months, and it was time to stop indulging grief. She said Caroline was throwing away a good man and a respectable future for nothing more than nerves. Caroline didn't argue. She went upstairs, opened Rachel's diary again, and read the final entries with new eyes. They weren't despair. They were a countdown. A record of attempts, each one a step towards separation, each one a failure. Rachel hadn't chosen death because she wanted to leave. She had chosen it because it was the only way she could stay. If she couldn't be separate, she would make separation impossible. Rachel hadn't escaped. She had ensured permanence. They would never be divided. Rachel would have her wedding. They would walk the aisle together, just not in any way the world would recognize. 3 days before what would have been Caroline's wedding, she finally stopped pretending she was alone. As the wedding day drew close, Caroline stopped leaving the bedroom altogether. Her mother left trays outside the door, meals carefully prepared, untouched by argument. Caroline ate because her body remembered how. She found herself craving peach yogurt, the kind Rachel had loved. Caroline had always thought it too sweet, too heavy on the tongue. Now it tasted right. Sleep came in fragments. When she dreamed things that weren't hers, memories she'd never lived, fears she'd never owned. She woke to discover she'd wandered the room in the night, footsteps she couldn't recall, furniture shifted just slightly. Rachel was testing the body, wearing it the way the dress waited in the closet downstairs. Once Caroline woke to the sound of fabric brushing softly. She lay utterly still, heart racing, and understood the truth with chilling clarity. Rachel was moving her, adjusting her posture, settling in. 2 days before the ceremony, her mother tried the door. It was locked. She knocked, then called, then pounded with rising panic. Finally, her voice sharpened into threats. Caroline lay on the bed, unmoving, feeling Rachel's satisfaction pulse through her spine. Her sister knew the time was close. The certainty was absolute. The day before, Caroline woke standing in front of the mirror. She wore her nightgown. Her feet were flat on the floor. Her back was straight, straighter than it had been in weeks. For a brief, dangerous moment, she felt almost normal. Then the truth landed. She hadn't chosen to stand. Rachel had. Caroline tried to step back. Her legs didn't respond. She tried to scream. Her mouth stayed closed. Panic roared inside her as she realized she was no longer in control. She was being warned. In the mirror, her lips moved. Words formed, soft, pleading, familiar. Rachel's tone, Rachel's cadence. Caroline heard her own voice say things she hadn't meant to say, things she couldn't fully hear. It lasted minutes, then the control faltered. Caroline crumpled to the floor, gasping. The air filled with the overpowering scent of lily of the valley, so thick it burned her lungs. The weight slammed back onto her shoulders, heavier than it had ever been. And Caroline finally understood what Rachel was offering her. Not death. Something far worse. A slow erasure, a patient replacement. Caroline's thoughts fatting day by day until she was only a whisper behind the glass, another shadow in the mirror, another presence clinging to someone else's life. On the morning that would have been her wedding day, Caroline woke before dawn. The house was silent. Her mother was already gone, at the church, managing flowers and explanations, smoothing over the disaster of a ceremony that would never happen. Guests would arrive confused. Questions would be deflected. Appearances preserved. Caroline sat up in bed. The weight rested on her shoulders, calm and expectant. She stood. The pressure on her shoulders was unbearable, dense, suffocating. But Caroline forced herself upright anyway. She crossed the room step by step, each movement an act of defiance, until she reached the closet. The dress waited inside. She took it down from the hanger, its weight unfamiliar in her hands, and carried it to the bed. She laid it out carefully, smoothing the fabric until it resembled a body at rest. The veil waited on the dresser, wrapped in its yellowed paper. Caroline unwrapped it slowly. With each layer peeled back, Rachel's longing surged, sharp, ravenous, almost painful. The lace was fragile and aged, smelling of dust and forgotten summers, of closed trunks and borrowed promises. It carried the history of women who had worn it before, vows whispered and broken, hopes pressed thin with time. She brought the veil to the vanity and sat on the narrow bench they had once shared, elbow to elbow, trading places in front of the mirror each morning. The reflection showed the truth now. Caroline's body curved forward, yes, but behind her, unmistakable, was another form. A second shoulder, the slope of a skull, another head pressed into the hollow of her neck, hiding there, clinging there, terrified of exposure. Caroline raised her hands to her hair. She began to style it as a bride would, pulled back, clean, restrained. Her fingers trembled. Rachel's grip tight, her will pushing hard, trying to guide the movement, to take control, to claim the ritual. Caroline slowed deliberately. She fumbled with the pins, removed them, started again. Every small delay was resistance. Every imperfect motion was proof. This body still answered to her. It was still hers, if only barely. When her hair was finally set, she lifted the veil. The lace trembled between her fingers, fragile enough to tear, fragile enough to vanish if mishandled. As she raised it, Rachel's excitement surged violently through her, a dizzying rush that made her knees weaken. Caroline placed the veil over her head. She adjusted it with care, letting it drape across her shoulders, hiding the curve of her spine, concealing Rachel beneath soft, yellowed lace. In the mirror, she almost looked right. Almost a bride, if you ignored the unnatural slope of her shoulders. If you didn't notice the second outline behind her own. Then Caroline reached forward and tilted the mirror. Just slightly. The change was subtle, but devastating. Her posture was flawless. Her back straight, her shoulders aligned. No hunch, no tension, no strain. What she had felt all this time wasn't weakness. It was weight. What she had been carrying these past weeks, what the doctor had misnamed, what everyone had dismissed, had never been her body failing. It was another body, another life, another bride, standing perfectly upright behind her, held aloft by Caroline's bones, wearing her skin, waiting patiently for the moment when the world would finally look at them and see only one woman standing at the altar. The burden bent her forward, heavy enough to steal breath, heavy enough to make her knees tremble. Still, she forced herself upright. One step at a time, she crossed the room to the closet where the gown waited in silence. She lifted it from its hook and carried it to the bed, spreading it carefully, the way one might lay out a body before burial. The veil rested on the dresser, wrapped in fatting tissue the color of old parchment. She unwrapped it slowly. With every movement, another presence stirred inside her, an eager pulse of longing that was not her own. The lace was thin, antique, stained softly by decades of hands and vows. It smelled of dust and memory, of promises whispered and broken long before her time. She sat at the vanity, on the bench they had once shared, where mornings were divided between laughter and rivalry. In the mirror she saw herself folded inward, her silhouette distorted, no longer one clean outline but two forms pressed unnaturally close. A second shape leaned into her neck, its weight unmistakable now, its fear palpable. She raised her hands to her hair and began to style it as brides always had, smooth, restrained, proper. Her fingers shook. Something tightened around her shoulders. A will pressed against her own, impatient, insistent, trying to guide her hands, trying to take control. She resisted. She slowed down, redid each pin, claimed each small motion as proof that this body still answered to her alone. When she finished, she lifted the veil. It felt fragile, as if it might dissolve at a careless touch. As she raised it, excitement surged through her veins, dizzying and sharp. She set it upon her head, letting the lace spill down, hiding the unnatural curve of her back, disguising what clung to her beneath the fabric. In the glass, she almost looked right, almost whole. Then she tilted the mirror. The truth rearranged itself instantly. She stood straight, perfectly straight. No strain, no collapse. What she had carried for weeks, what the doctor had dismissed, what her mother had scolded, was never weakness at all. It was weight. Arms locked around her throat, legs cinched tight at her waist, a body pressed flush against her spine, clinging like a child terrified of being set down. A face buried into the hollow of her neck. Only fragments showed in the reflection. A cheekbone, strands of hair, fingers gripping with desperate strength. Rachel's eyes were closed, peaceful, waiting. The veil covered them both, turning them into one impossible figure, a bride bearing more than any woman was meant to carry. Her breath stuttered. She lifted her hands to her shoulders and watched, stunned, as her fingers overlapped with another pair. Two sets of hands, one space. Rachel, she breathed. Her sister's eyes opened, not in the room, but in the mirror, as if that reflection was the only place she still existed. The look was achingly familiar, the same terror-filled gaze from childhood nights when sleep would not come unless they stayed together. Understanding settled like ice. Rachel hadn't wanted the wedding. She had needed it so completely that she could not survive without it. She had abandoned her own engagement rather than walk forward alone. And when life threatened to separate them anyway, she had found another way. A colder way. a way that ensured she would never be left behind. The veil, the altar, the vows, she would have them all, if not as a bride, then as a shadow, as a weight, as something riding inside the body of the one person she could never bear to lose. A chill brushed Caroline's neck like a kiss. She removed the veil and laid it carefully on the dresser, smoothing the lace flat. In the mirror, Rachel watched, fear tightening her grip, settling her weight deeper as though expecting rejection, expecting to be cast off. Caroline did not move. Some bonds once made were never meant to be broken. She did nothing to flee it. She remained where she was, unmoving, studying the image in the glass, two figures bound together, fused by habit and history. This was how it had always been, how their mother had spoken to them, dressed them, corrected them, how the world had learned to see them, and how neither of them had ever been taught to stand alone. Her thoughts drifted to William, to the ceremony that would never unfold, to the future she had carefully imagined, one that she now realized had only ever existed in theory. She thought of the other man too, the one Rachel had nearly married, of that shattered promise, of those final weeks when Rachel had carried the same invisible burden, fought the same internal battle, struggled to want something separate, something that belonged only to her. The memory of the barn surfaced, the rough rope, the short note, "I'm sorry." At last, the apology made sense. It was never about dying. It was about failing, about not being strong enough to carry them both. Rachel hadn't chosen death because she wanted to leave. She chose it because the wedding would have demanded separation, and separation would have required her to become someone who existed without Caroline. That had never been a skill she learned. Caroline turned from the mirror. When she stood, the weight shifted seamlessly, practiced and familiar. Another body adjusted to hers instinctively. They had learned this long ago, how to share balance, how to walk in sync, how to occupy a single path without stumbling. She crossed to the window and looked out at the soft April light. Dogwood trees bloomed white against the yard. The driveway lay empty. No car approached. No groom would arrive. Beyond the yard stretched the road to the church, where her mother waited beside an altar, dressed for vows that would never be spoken. She wondered about what lay ahead, about years spent like this, never truly alone, never truly whole, about carrying another presence through every hour, every breath, about the slow erosion of a body never meant to support two lives. She imagined the end, her strength failing, her bones bending, her breath shortening under the strain of shared need and shared fear. She considered the other possibility, letting go, becoming singular, living as one. But she had no idea how. They had divided badly at the start, two identical dresses, two mirrored lives, two women raised without the language of separation, and now one reflection. Behind her, the mirror held Rachel's gaze, patient, expectant. In it, Caroline saw what awaited her. Years from now, still bent under the same weight, still standing at windows, still watching lives pass by, marriages, departures, endings that they would never step into, not together, not apart. Then the church bells began to ring. Slow, steady, final. The bells were ringing because her mother would have insisted. Tradition demanded noise. Appearances demanded sound. In a town like this, silence would have been louder than grief. So the bells rang, firm and unwavering, announcing joy where there was none, summoning a bride who would never answer. Their echo rolled across the morning air, claiming this hour as sacred. An hour that had been meant for vows and footsteps and lace brushing down the aisle. An hour when Caroline should have been walking forward in borrowed silk and inherited lace, carrying more than fabric, carrying the hidden truth of her sister clinging to her like a second spine, like a secret stitched beneath her skin. She shut her eyes. Rachel's face rested against her neck, cold and familiar. Fingers dug into her shoulders, not cruelly, but desperately. An instinctive hold, the grip of someone terrified of falling away. Caroline felt the same pressure that had broken Rachel in the end, the same unrelenting closeness that would one day hollow her out too. This was the cost of never being apart. This was the weight of loving and being loved without limits, so completely that even death failed to make space between them. Outside, the bells refused to stop. They kept calling, faithful and blind, insisting upon a celebration that no longer existed. A wedding delayed by months, erased by time, undone before it ever began. Or perhaps already completed, just not in the way anyone wanted to admit. Not beneath stained glass, but beneath wooden beams. Not before witnesses, but in isolation. Not with rings and promises, but with rope and gravity. Not with vows spoken aloud, but with a final apology scrawled in ink. I'm sorry. An ending that promised union more truthfully than any ceremony ever could. Caroline remained at the window, unmoving, bearing Rachel's weight as the sound washed over her again and again. The bells declared unity, permanence forever, as if they had ever known anything else, as if separation had ever truly existed between them, as if death had been enough to break what had never learned how to be divided in the first place. Story 2, something answered from below. The problem with the floor didn't announce itself right away. It waited. For nearly a month, Olivia barely left her bed. The cast on her left leg forced her into stillness, into long hours of staring at the same ceiling cracks, the same peeling paint, the same slice of afternoon light creeping across the room. When you're trapped like that, a place begins to confess things you'd never notice otherwise. Small flaws rise to the surface. Tiny lies reveal themselves. The loose board was one of them. It sat near the end of the bed, blending in at first. Same width, same grain, but darker, as if it had lived a longer life than the others. When Olivia finally pressed it with her uninjured foot, it didn't resist the way it should have. It dipped, shifted, and from somewhere beneath it she sensed movement. Not a sound exactly, more like the suggestion of breath being released. She froze. The building was old. That much was obvious from the moment she toured the apartment. A Victorian relic carved into smaller lives decades ago, its bones still intact beneath the renovations. Ornate molding traced the ceilings. The windows trembled whenever the wind leaned too hard against them. Everything here remembered something. The landlord had casually mentioned repairs happening on the floor below when Olivia signed the lease. Second floor. Temporary noise, he'd said. Minor updates. She remembered the plywood sheet bolted across that apartment's door, raw and unfinished. But in the 6 months she'd lived here, there had been no drills, no hammering, no footsteps beneath her floor. Only silence. Her leg pulsed with a deep, dull ache, the kind that settled into the bones. Her pain medication would run out the next day. She already knew the nights were the worst, when the darkness stripped away distractions and left her alone with her body, her thoughts, and the apartment's quiet attention. She shifted again, carefully this time. Her heel brushed the loose board. It moved, and from below, something responded. The board shifted again. This time it didn't just wobble, it rose, just enough to break the illusion that the floor was solid. A narrow slit opened beneath it, no wider than 2 fingers. Olivia leaned forward, the edge of her cast rasping softly against the metal frame of the bed. There was nothing to see below, only blackness, not the flat dark of an unlit room, but something deeper, layered. Cold air slipped up through the opening and brushed her skin, carrying a smell that made her stomach tighten. Paper left too long in moisture, ink dissolving, time rotting quietly. She eased the board back into place and lay flat, suddenly conscious of her pulse thudding in her ears. The crash had been months ago. The break came later, but her body seemed to remember the first impact more clearly than the second. She'd been driving too fast, one hand on the wheel, the other glowing with messages she shouldn't have been reading. The street had narrowed unexpectedly. Scaffolding leaned closer than it should have. The contact was light, metal kissing metal, but in her mirror she'd seen a shape stumble backward, a flash of yellow helmet, arms windmilling as gravity claimed him. She hadn't slowed down. In the days that followed, she searched obsessively. Local news, hospital updates, community boards, nothing. No mention of an accident, no injured worker, no investigation. The absence of evidence became her shield. She built a story where no one had fallen, where the harness had held, where she had imagined the worst. The dreams disagreed. They came anyway, slow, sinking dreams where she was always looking down at something she couldn't quite see. 2 weeks later, she slipped on black ice with a bag of groceries digging into her arm. The pain was immediate, clean, undeniable. In the hospital, the doctor asked about recent trauma, his eyes lingering a fraction too long on her face. She answered automatically, thinking he meant the fall. Later, alone, she wondered if he'd meant something else. That night, unable to sleep, she took an envelope from the dresser and wrote a single line on the back. "Hello from upstairs." She hesitated, then added her name. She folded the paper carefully, not into a letter but into something childish. A plane. When she nudged the loose board open again and let it slip through the gap, it vanished without a sound, swallowed whole. Nothing happened. 3 days passed. Pain settled into her bones like weather, constant and oppressive. Sleep came in fragments. The building filled the silence. Old structures always spoke, she knew that, but this felt different, measured. Footsteps packing below her bed, stopping directly under her headboard. Tapping that repeated in patterns, 3 beats, a pause too, another pause, then 3 again. She tried to read. The words slid off her thoughts. On the 4th night, the tapping changed. It moved closer to the loose board. The lines in her book refused to stay together. Letters drifted apart, reassembled, then lost meaning again. She would reach the end of a paragraph only to realize she hadn't truly read any of it. Her thoughts kept slipping back to the narrow opening near her bed, the faint breath of cold that crept upward each night, the way the air smelled old and enclosed, as if it had been sealed away for years. She told herself there was nothing beneath the floor but empty space, old beams, insulation, forgotten crawl space. Buildings like this were full of hollows no one ever thought about. On the 4th afternoon, she lifted the loose board again, intending to let the space air out. Something pale rested just beneath the opening. It wasn't moving. It didn't need to. It sat pressed close to the gap, positioned with careful intention, as though a hand below had raised it as far as it could reach and then waited. Olivia's throat tightened. She used a bent wire hanger, easing it down until it snagged the object and drew it upward. It was her envelope. The paper had been unfolded, smoothed, and written on. "Thank you for your letter. It has been quite some time since anyone thought to write. My name is Thomas. I reside directly beneath you, though circumstances prevent me from leaving my room. The arrangements are less than ideal, but one grows accustomed to such things. Do you live alone? The script was precise, deliberate, shaped with the care of someone raised on penmanship drills. Each capital letter curled into itself with unnecessary elegance. The paper carried a damp scent, mildew perhaps, and beneath it something sharper, metallic, like pennies held too long in a warm hand. She read it once, then again, then a third time slower. The second floor apartment was sealed. She knew that. Plywood covered the doorway, weathered and layered with warnings from inspectors and city officials. She passed it every time she climbed the stairs, her crutches scraping, her breath shallow with effort. No one lived there. And yet someone had answered. The thought that unsettled her most wasn't that a stranger existed below her, but that she might have written the response herself, that the medication had opened some hidden fault in her mind, allowed words to surface she didn't remember thinking. That possibility felt worse. She wrote back anyway. Yes, I live alone. I broke my leg. I can't move around much. What room are you in? She folded the note, slid it down through the opening, and replaced the board. The answer arrived before morning. When she woke, the floorboard sat slightly raised, as if nudged upward from below. A nearly invisible line threaded through the gap, thin as spider silk. The paper was attached with a bent piece of wire, shaped into a crude hook. She pulled gently. The line slid smoothly, unspooling from the darkness without resistance, until the note reached her hand. A small room, very little light. The walls are close on all sides. I sleep often. I hear you above me. The way you move, the uneven rhythm of your steps, the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. Are you in pain? Her fingers trembled. He knew how she moved. He knew about the weight she pulled behind her when she crossed the room. And somehow, impossibly, he had found a way to write back. To read, the novel stacked precariously on the nightstand, the scraps of poetry she had once loved but never shared. She wrote about the meals delivered by her sister, about the peach yogurt she had started craving despite her distaste. Each note took longer to fold, each message lingering in her fingers, as if the act of sending it somehow connected her to the strange, unseen presence below. Tom's replies grew more detailed. He described the cracks in the plaster above his head, the way shadows pooled in the corners of his room, the strange rhythm of the pipes as they shifted through the walls. He spoke as though he had been listening to her movements all along, cataloging them. The scrape of the cast on the floor, the dull tap of her crutches, the sighs that escaped her when the leg throbbed. I can hear you tonight. You move slowly, cautiously, as if the floor remembers your weight. You drag something, a cast perhaps. It is heavy. Does it hurt? She shivered as she read. How could he know? She had not moved from the bed in hours, and yet in the silence beneath the floor someone or something had heard her. Olivia paused before replying. Her hand hovered over the paper, the pen trembling slightly. Yes, it hurts. A lot. And you, how did you get this set up? How do you know so much about me? The envelope went down. Hours passed. The apartment seemed to settle around her, the old wood creaking in its own rhythms. She tried to read, tried to focus on the words in her novel, but her eyes kept drifting to the loose floorboard, to the gap beneath it, to the impossibility of the letters that continued to appear as if summoned by some hidden hand. Then the response came, faster this time, almost immediate. I know because I listen, I measure. I watch the spaces between the floorboards, the way shadows move with you. I have been here longer than you can imagine, though you have not seen me. The light shifts slowly, the walls grow damp, the air thickens, and I am still here. Are you afraid? Olivia's fingers tightened around the note. She should have been terrified. And yet, something about the careful loops of the handwriting, the deliberate patience in the phrasing, made her pulse slow, made her feel almost connected, almost understood. She wrote back in a careful hand, words deliberate, testing the rules of this strange game, afraid. Maybe, but not alone. I suppose that is something. And as the envelope slipped through the gap, she felt it. The faint vibration of the string beneath the floorboard, as if it had already been waiting for her words, ready to respond, ready to keep the conversation going, and maybe, just maybe, ready to reach even further. Jawline the hollow of her cheeks from weeks in bed. She sketched slowly, deliberately, each line trembling, unsure if she was drawing herself, or some version of herself seen through the lens of confinement. When she finished, she folded the page and lowered it carefully through the floorboard gap. The paper disappeared into darkness as silently as it had gone down before. Hours passed. The apartment felt heavier, the air thicker, as if it were holding its breath along with her. She tried to sleep, tried to close her eyes against the ache in her leg, against the growing awareness of being watched, but the silence below the floorboard seemed to pulse with expectation. Then a small scrape against the board, a soft, precise movement, and the reply came. You are more than your circumstances. I can see it in the lines of your face, in the angle of your jaw, the tension in your shoulders. I think of you as you rest and you draw. I do not need to see to know. You are careful, deliberate, aware of yourself. And still, you are trapped. How long before the walls themselves begin to press on you? Olivia froze, her fingers tightening around the edge of the bed. Trapped, she thought, as a shiver slid down her spine. He, or whatever was down there, knew things she had not spoken aloud. The careful notes, the attention to her movements, the immediacy of his responses. It was impossible to explain as coincidence. She wanted to write back, but the words caught in her throat. Eventually she did, and the note went down with trembling hands. I don't know how you know. I don't know who you are. I don't feel trapped. I just wait. The reply was almost instant. Waiting is its own kind of cage. But you do not see the walls that bend around you, Olivia. Not yet. Soon, the floorboards will not be the only thing separating us. Soon, you will understand that some doors open only from the inside and some never open at all. Her heart skipped. She knew with a sudden, sinking certainty that he meant more than the literal walls of the apartment. Something in his words suggested patience, inevitability, something waiting beneath her feet that had been listening all along. Not for hours, not for days, but for longer. She lay back in bed, the cast heavy on her leg, the floorboard beneath her stirring with imperceptible shifts. The notes continued to slide up and down like whispers through a secret tunnel, and Olivia understood, suddenly, that she was no longer the only one shaping the space. Something beneath, something patient and deliberate, was writing back. And it was learning her. The first time Olivia dropped the folded note through the crack in the floorboard, she thought it was a harmless gesture, just a lonely attempt to break the silence of her confined apartment. By the time she woke that night, the shadows in her room felt thicker, heavier, as though the darkness itself had grown impatient. The floorboard was shifted, slightly lifted, and beside her bed lay a piece of paper she hadn't seen before. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded it, and what she saw made her stomach tight. It wasn't her drawing. It was her, but not from her perspective. The sketch looked up from beneath the floorboards, capturing the curve of her jaw, the tilt of her cheek, the slope of her shoulders, every detail precise, familiar, terrifying. Her eyes stared wide, her mouth frozen in a scream she had never made, a horror she could not recall feeling. Behind her, the artist had traced the outlines of her room. The lamp on the nightstand, the dresser, the bed, every object rendered as though observed through the cracks in the floor. Olivia's hand lifted to her own face, fingers pressing against her cheeks, trying to mirror the expression. But it refused her. Her muscles would not betray her the way the drawing did. The terror in those eyes was not her own. It was someone else. Someone had been looking up at her, watching her from below, studying her every movement. Her gaze fell to the gap in the floorboard. In the darkness beneath, something shifted. Not paper, something alive, pale, curved, as if breathing. A chill shot through her, making her cast feel heavier than it should, as though it had absorbed the weight of the shadow beneath her. Ignoring the sharp pain that lanced up her leg, she swung it over the edge of the bed. Crutches in hand, she made her way to the stairs, each step sending jolts of agony up her body, each movement echoing in the empty hall. The stairwell smelled of mildew, old wood, and something acrid that burned her nose. The second-floor apartment door loomed ahead just as she remembered it. Plywood nailed across the frame, yellowed notices peeling with age. Years-old warnings about structural decay and toxic mold stared at her from faded paper. She pressed her ear against the wood. Silence. Absolute, unbroken silence. Then, almost imperceptibly, a faint scratching. Slow, deliberate, rhythmic, like fingernails dragging across wood. Her heart hammered. She leaned closer, eyes scanning the notices again. One from 2019, another from 2020. How could anyone be inside? The apartment had been sealed for years. Yet the notes, the drawings, the responses, they all came from someone below. Someone confined. Someone who called it a room, never an apartment, who had found a way to live unseen while watching her. And suddenly, Olivia realized. She had not been sending messages into emptiness. She had been reaching out to a presence that had already been there, waiting, observing, breathing just beneath the floorboards. Olivia froze, staring at the floorboard as if it might answer the questions that had begun clawing at her mind. The crack had widened since last she looked, enough for her to glimpse into the black pit beneath her bedroom floor. She could feel it there, the impossibility of it. A space that had always been empty now seemed alive, waiting. Her heart thumped in her chest as she eased onto the bed, trying to calm her thoughts, trying to make sense of the notes stacked beside her. She picked up Tom's letters again, reading the carefully looping handwriting as though it might contain some hidden clue she had missed. The walls are close on all sides. I can hear you moving above me. I have been here longer than anticipated. The words pressed against her chest. Not an apartment. A room, small, low ceiling, claustrophobic. He hadn't called it a living space. He had called it confinement. She shivered. Someone had been trapped beneath her, observing her every movement, existing in the shadows she had never thought to notice. Needing perspective, she pulled herself to the window. The street below was empty, stripped bare of life. Trees reached upward like black, skeletal fingers against a pale winter sky. Winter, she blinked. Hadn't it been autumn when she broke her leg? The leaves had been gold and crimson, but the branches now whispered only gray and cold. Her vision blurred. Pain, medication, fog. Her memory could not be trusted. Her laptop beckoned. She searched obsessively, fingers trembling over the keys. Construction accident. Missing person. Thomas Carver. Tom. Anything that might explain this impossible correspondence. And then she found it. A short article buried in the archives, dated 3 months ago, the same day she had clipped the scaffolding with her car. Thomas Carver, 32, construction worker, fell from scaffolding outside a Victorian home. Witnesses reported a vehicle striking the structure. The driver did not stop. Carver was alone. Body not recovered at scene. Investigation ongoing. Olivia reread the words 3 times, each repetition clawing further into her chest. The date aligned perfectly with the crash she had glimpsed in her rearview mirror, the figure falling, the motion she had tried to rationalize, the guilt she had buried. Thomas Carver, Tom, the name she had thought was fiction, a casual identifier for a hidden correspondent, now matched a man who had ceased to exist. She closed the laptop abruptly, but the quiet panic refused to leave her. January 15th. How could it be January? Her leg had been broken in late October, 2 weeks, not 3 months. Her calendar, her notes, the fatting hospital bracelet on her wrist, everything insisted time had moved without her consent. She held the bracelet under the lamp, the ink smudged, nearly illegible. October 5th. That had been her admission. That had been the start. 3 months of fog, of pain, of isolation, compressed into her fractured memory. And beneath the floor, the space where Tom had been confined, Olivia realized with a sickening certainty that her letters, her careful gestures of connection, had been sent not to a living neighbor but to someone, or something, that had ceased to exist long before she ever reached out. The shadows beneath her bedroom floor had been more than wood and darkness. They had been a doorway, a witness, a presence that had survived the accident she had barely acknowledged. Her pulse raced. Every sound, the creak of a floorboard, the sigh of the wind against the window, the distant tapping in the walls, was no longer mundane. It was intentional, calculated, alive. Tom had been there. Tom had been watching. And now Olivia understood he, or what remained of him, still lingered, waiting for her to look, to see, to know. The room felt impossibly small, as if the walls themselves leaned closer, pressing in. The shadows beneath the floorboard shifted again, and Olivia's stomach twisted. She could not tell if what she saw moving was real, or a trick of the half-light in her anxious imagination. Her fingers brushed against the crack in the wood, and the air that rose from it felt cold and sent a shiver straight to her bones. She was not alone. She had never been alone. And the truth, impossible and terrible, was waiting for her to acknowledge it. She noticed it the moment she sat down. The floorboard wasn't just loose anymore. It was yawning open, like it had been pulled apart from the inside. Her pulse jumped. She knelt, peering into the slit between the planks. Nothing, just a darkness so complete it felt intentional, as if light itself refused to go there. She backed away and forced herself to breathe. The notes were still where she'd kept them, tucked neatly into the drawer beside her bed. She laid them out one by one, smoothing the creases, rereading every line with new suspicion. They were gentle, thoughtful, almost tender. Questions about how the sun moved across her walls, comments about the sound she made packing at night, observations no one should have been able to make unless they were directly beneath her. Not beneath her apartment. Beneath her. A place with low ceilings, tight walls, no windows, a place where time blurred and darkness swallowed hours whole. Her skin prickled. She crossed the room and yanked the curtains aside. The street below looked abandoned. Trees stood stripped bare, their branches thin and black against a washed-out sky. Winter trees, deep winter. That made no sense. She was certain, absolutely certain, that when she'd hurt her leg, the leaves had still been clinging to the branches. Gold, rust, red. "This is the medication," she muttered, though the words felt weak even as she said them. She turned to her laptop, unsure what she was searching for, but certain she'd know it when she saw it. News, local incidents, accidents. She typed names, streets, dates. Then she narrowed it. Construction accident, her street, 3 months ago. The article was short, clinical. A worker had fallen from scaffolding during renovations on a historic home. Witnesses mentioned a car hitting the structure. The driver hadn't stopped. The worker had been alone. His body was never recovered, though evidence suggested he couldn't have survived. Named Thomas Carver. Her chest tightened. She checked the date again and again. The same day she remembered the jolt. The same day she'd seen a figure drop in her rearview mirror. The same day she'd kept driving. Her laptop clock read January 15. "That's wrong," she whispered. She opened the calendar. October, November, December, January. The time was undeniable. Her wrist tingled. She looked down and saw the hospital band still clinging there, bleached and worn. She held it under the lamp, squinting until the numbers came into focus. Admitted October 5. Discharged October 12. 3 months ago. The truth didn't strike her all at once. It crept in quietly, stitching itself together from details she'd ignored. The cracked cast, the emptiness of her pill bottles, her sister's offhand comment about how long it had been since she'd gone outside, meals she couldn't remember eating, groceries that vanished without memory. 90 days. Long enough for a man trapped below ground to run out of water. Long enough for desperation to rot into something else. She went to the kitchen. The ache in her leg felt old now, deep, settled, wrong. The refrigerator door hung open a fraction. One bottle of water was missing. The trash held an empty soup can, chicken noodle, a brand she recognized. She didn't remember eating it. Back in her bedroom, something caught her eye. On the nightstand sat a rusted nail, old, thick, the kind pulled from beams. Beside it, her water glass bore a smear along the rim, brown, grainy. She touched it. Dirt. Her stomach dropped. The pipes began tapping again. 3 knocks, pause 2, pause 3. Over and over. She typed frantically, translating the pattern. SOS. Her hands trembled as understanding crashed over her. He hadn't been chatting. He'd been pleading for weeks, maybe longer, while she slept, while she swallowed pills and lost days, while he waited below her floor, sending signals into the walls. Her phone was charging beside the bed. She grabbed it, dialing before fear could stop her. Then she froze. What could she say? That the man she'd been talking to was officially dead, that he might still be there, that something, someone, had been living beneath her feet. The tapping started again. Closer this time. From the floor. Not asking anymore. Waiting. Living beneath her floor while she slept. The thought hollowed her out. She looked back at her phone. The call log was empty in a way that felt unnatural. The last outgoing call was dated October. After that, nothing. No messages, no missed calls, no check-ins. 3 full months erased, as if the outside world had quietly agreed to forget her. No deliveries, no visits, no concern. Just silence. And the presence below. She set the phone aside and returned to the floor. The opening between the boards had grown wider, no longer subtle, no longer something that could be explained away. It looked intentional now, prepared. She lowered herself carefully, ignoring the protest in her leg, and slid her hand into the gap. Cold brushed her fingers. Not air, not dust. A thin line. She traced it downward, her breath shallow, following it inch by inch until her fingertips brushed something curved and hard. Not wood, not metal, something smooth in places, porous in others, wrapped in fabric that disintegrated at her touch, collapsing into damp threads. She recoiled, pulling back instinctively. Whatever was attached came with her. The mechanism rose into the light, exposed at last. A crude pulley, wire twisted tight around something pale and unmistakable, small, human. A finger bone, clean where it had been handled, darkened at the joint where scraps of something dried still clung. A hole had been drilled straight through it, the fishing line threaded neatly in place. Her stomach turned violently. This was what she'd been using. Every message, every note, every careful exchange. She hauled them up with a coat hanger, never once questioning the weight, the texture, the way it resisted just slightly when it passed through the floor. She had never really looked. Below her, something had been guiding the line, feeding it upward through the boards, waiting for her to fall asleep, timing the movement for when the medication softened her senses, listening to her footsteps, learning her routines. Her gaze drifted to the folded drawing, still resting on her nightstand. She unfolded it slowly. It showed her from below. Not imagined, not symbolic. Accurate. Her face distorted by fear, eyes wide, mouth parted as if she were about to scream, seen through the fractured geometry of floorboards. The perspective was wrong unless the artist had been lying beneath her, staring up. It wasn't a warning. It was a memory. Her heart pounded as realization followed realization, each worse than the last. The accident hadn't been recent. The drawing hadn't been recent either. It could have been made weeks after the fall, months. No one survives 3 months sealed beneath a house. Not without water. Not without help. Unless it hadn't survived at all. Unless it had stayed anyway. Waiting. Learning. Communicating. The tapping began again, louder now. Closer. No longer distant through the pipes, but resonant through the wood itself. 3 knocks. Pause 2, pause 3. Not a plea anymore. A signal that had already been answered. He had been there before she ever learned his name. Before she unpacked her boxes. Before she decided where the bed would go. Before she convinced herself the building was just old and full of harmless noises. He had been alive beneath her feet. Listening. She tried to force the timeline to make sense, but it refused to sit still. She had signed the lease 6 months ago. The accident was only 3 months old. That meant he couldn't have been waiting for her arrival, unless the order of events wasn't what she thought. Unless the crash and the apartment were never separate things at all. Her laptop hummed softly as she pulled up public records. Old ones. Yellowed scans of architectural drawings dating back to the 1800s, then newer revisions layered clumsily on top during a renovation nearly 50 years later. The house had been split, reshaped, carved into modern units, but not cleanly. There were gaps, dead spaces, hidden volumes between the original beams and the newer walls, areas the renovation had deliberately avoided, cavities beneath floors where the foundation didn't line up with what came later. One space was marked differently. A red X, a handwritten warning, not for use, structural risk. It sat directly beneath her bedroom. Her breath slowed as understanding crept in. Tom had never described an apartment. He had described confinement, low clearance, walls too close, darkness that made time meaningless. A crawl space, barely tall enough to kneel, narrow enough to trap a grown man if he fell the wrong way, accessible only through fractures in the floor above. A place where someone injured, bones broken, body stunned, could survive for days, maybe weeks, not months. She returned to the accident, replaying it with brutal clarity. The scaffolding outside this very building, the jolt, the blur in her mirror, the shape falling, not forward into the street but backward, swallowed by the structure itself. The article had mentioned blood, but no body. What if he hadn't hit the pavement at all? What if the impact sent him through an opening, through unfinished stone and into the forgotten space beneath her room? What if he had been trapped there alive, while she moved in above him months later, completely unaware? Her stomach tightened. She told herself she would have noticed, she would have heard him. She wasn't careless, she wasn't cruel. But then she remembered the tapping, the sounds she dismissed as old pipes, the faint movements she blamed on animals, the nights she turned over and pulled the blanket tighter instead of listening. She had heard him. She had chosen not to understand. And when the painkillers dulled her senses, when time blurred and days vanished, he had learned how to speak to her. Not with his voice, but with patience, with notes, with careful, quiet hope, until hope ran out. She had blamed the noises on age and neglect, on warped wood and a settling building, anything but the truth. Her leg throbbed as she stared at the cast. It no longer looked like something meant to heal. The surface was dull, cracked, flacking away in soft gray dust. She pressed it gently and felt an unsettling shift beneath, a wrongness deep inside, as if the bone had never fully knitted back together. 3 months had passed. It should have been stronger by now. Instead, the pain had grown heavier, duller, permanent. The kind of ache that comes from damage left too long without care. In the bathroom, the evidence was impossible to ignore. Every pill bottle sat empty. When she turned them over, layers of pharmacy labels peeled back like rings on a tree. October, November, December. Each one proof she had been numbed and sleeping through far more time than she remembered. 3 months of silence. 3 months of not listening. Back in the bedroom, the gap in the floor had widened enough to feel intentional. She switched on her phone's light and aimed it downward. The space below stared back. It was exactly as he described. Tight walls closing in, a ceiling so low no one could stand upright. Damp earth, cold stone, but scattered through the dirt were signs of survival. A shattered hard hat, an empty thermos, torn scraps of fabric that might once have been clothing. And then something else. In the far corner, half swallowed by shadow, was a shape that didn't belong to debris. It was wrong in a way her mind resisted numbing. Too curved, too deliberate. It moved. Her grip failed. The phone hit the floor and skidded away, its light spinning wildly, throwing jagged shadows across the room. She dragged herself backward, heart hammering, her cast scraping against the floor with a harsh, dragging sound. The sound he had heard. The board lifted. Not a crack anymore, not a gap. The floor itself rose, bending upward like a mouth opening. The darkness beneath stretched wide enough for someone to crawl through, someone thin, hollowed out, stripped down by hunger and time. A hand reached up. Skin clung loosely to bone, pale and translucent, fingers too long, joints sharp beneath stretched flesh. It gripped the edge of the floor with desperate strength. Something pulled itself closer, and from below she finally heard breathing. A second arm followed, then the slow rise of a shoulder that bent the wrong way, rotating with a sick patience no living body should possess. Each movement carried the quiet confession of bones that had snapped, shifted, and fused back together without help, without mercy. The breathing was unmistakable now, thick, gurgling, wet. Not the breath of someone alive and healthy, but of lungs that had spent months drowning one shallow inhale at a time. The smell reached her next. It poured out of the opening like a wave, damp soil, rusted metal, decay, and beneath it all something disturbingly familiar, a faint trace of soap or cologne, the ghost of a man who had once started his mornings clean, upright, human. She had assumed the letters stopped because he was gone. The truth was worse. They had stopped because he no longer needed paper. The space between them, wood, silence, denial, had finally thinned enough to break. The thing that emerged was not what fear had prepared her for. It wasn't reduced to fragments. It wasn't skeletal ruin. It was intact, too intact. Flesh still clung to it. Eyes still moved, tracking her with dull awareness. A mouth still opened as if speech had never fully left it. 3 months underground should have erased a body. This one had endured. Its skin sagged, gray and loose, as though it no longer fit what remained underneath. A cracked hard hat still rested on its head, fused to the story of the day it fell. Slowly, joint by joint, it straightened itself, every motion deliberate, careful, practiced. This was not a creature rushing for freedom. This was something that had learned patience in the dark. It had waited 90 days. A few more seconds meant nothing. When it spoke, the sound matched the letters she'd memorized. Calm, measured, old-fashioned, a voice that still believed in manners. Olivia, just her name. Nothing else was needed. The word carried recognition, blame, an unbearable familiarity. She tried to rise. Her leg refused. The cast dragged her down like an anchor, impossibly heavy now, as if it had absorbed more than time, more than neglect. She could only sit there, breath locked in her chest, watching as what had once been Thomas Carver stepped fully into her apartment. Behind him, the crawl space lay exposed at last. With the room flooded in light, its secrets were impossible to ignore. The walls pressed inward exactly as he'd written. The ceiling crouched low, hostile, inescapable. And in the far corner, half seen, half remembered, was something else. A shape that did not move. A shape that might have been another body. Or what was left behind. What was left behind had stayed in the corner, discarded when whatever still had will crawled upward. It reached her and lowered itself slowly, carefully, until its face hovered inches from hers. Up close, the illusion of wholeness fell apart. Parts of it weren't fully there. Flesh thinned until it became translucent, the wall behind visible through patches of skin. In other places, bone pressed outward, gray, spongy, unfinished. But the eyes were sharp, present, aware. And then it smiled. "Thank you for writing," it said gently, in that same measured voice. "It has been a long time since anyone spoke to me." The truth finally arranged itself in her mind. Not all at once, piece by piece. The accident wasn't the worst thing she'd done. Neither was driving away. Neither was pretending the sounds didn't exist. The real damage came after. The letters. Every message she sent hadn't just reached him, it had fed him. Each sentence, each small confession about her life, each description of light on the wall or pain in her leg had given him something essential. Meaning, attention, proof that he still existed. While his body failed, something else endured. And now it was strong enough. "Do you live alone?" it asked again, almost politely. She couldn't answer. She never needed to. It had known all along. It had listened to her breathe, watched her sleep, counted the days with her, 3 months of quiet coexistence. She tried to scream. Nothing came out. Her throat locked around the sound. She tried to pull away, dragging herself backward across the floor, but her leg refused to move. The cast might as well have been stone. Cold fingers touched her face. They felt wrong, too light, too numb, like frost wrapped in damp fabric. She stared into its clouded eyes and saw herself reflected there, frozen in absolute terror. The same expression, the one from the drawing. Not a prediction, a memory. Understanding crushed down on her, heavy and final. The thing she feared hadn't arrived, it had been there from the beginning. Guilt wasn't a feeling, it was a place. A narrow, dark space built slowly, plank by plank, until there was no room left to stand. Some falls didn't end lives. Some only changed them. It took her gently, almost tenderly, guiding her toward the open gap in the floor, toward the low ceiling, toward the room that had learned how to wait. As she was pulled down, the house exhaled. Old wood creaked and settled, relieved, as though a long imbalance had finally been corrected. Above them, the loose board slid back into place. The opening vanished. The apartment fell silent, empty once more, ready for someone new. Someone who would ignore the warnings downstairs. Someone who would lie awake at night and hear tapping in the walls and dismiss it as age. In the darkness below, Olivia was positioned carefully in the corner. Time dissolved immediately. Minutes and months lost their shape. He had told her the truth. Sometimes it felt like days. Sometimes like years. And then she felt paper pressed into her hand. Her own note. The one she had dropped through the floor long ago. On the back, written in careful, looping letters, were new words. Hello from below. We've been waiting.